Hello, my name is Jesse Heath, and this is my week one discussion board video for American Revolution at Liberty University Online. I'm recording this video from within my office at the International Pentecostal Holiness Church Archives and Research Center, where I serve as an assistant archivist. Looming about 180 feet above the heads of tourist senators, representatives, and other congressional aides, one of the greatest leaders of American history looks down upon those below with solemn, authoritative eyes. I'm describing the Apotheosis of Washington, that is George Washington, the first president of the United States. The Apotheosis of Washington is located in the eye of the rotunda of the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This is an image of the Apotheosis of Washington. While the Apotheosis of Washington could be considered an example of public history preserved and presented by the United States architect of the Capitol within our federal government, it is more precisely an example of hagiography. Hagiography is a type of history that presents its subjects in a glowing or exalted manner, often maybe even divine. The subjects are often considered and presented as heroes or saints, according to our presentation lecture this week. Thus, the title Apotheosis describes the divine exaltation of George Washington himself. Within the fresco, George Washington is presented quite divinely. He is seated, and yet, as the architect of the Capitol explains, he is, quote, rising to the heavens in glory, end quote. Washington's depiction here is interesting because he is draped with a lavender robe, often reserved for royalty, and he's also displayed in his military uniform. Washington is honored in this fresco, in this manner, for his military leadership and also his presidency as the first president of the United States, especially during his leadership of the American Revolution. Washington was elected as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in May 1775 and took command of the American colonial forces not even 2 months later on July 3, 1775. Washington would lead the American forces to victory, eventually forcing the British Army of General Charles Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. This according to the White House website on President George Washington. The centrality and divinity of George Washington in this fresco is quite significant and suitable. Washington's portrayal among some other Roman mythological figures showed how, even in the mid-19th century, many Americans considered Washington, quote, superior, end quote, to even the ancient heroes of Rome, according to Barbara Wollanen, the former curator of the architect of the Capitol. This undoubtedly comes from his military victories during the American Revolution. Washington would be instrumental also in the layout of Washington, D.C., after the Residence Act was passed in 1790 by Congress, eventually approving the plans for the United States Capitol building himself on July 25, 1793. Washington would participate in the laying of the cornerstone of the Capitol building on September 18, 1793. Here, I've shown an image of the cornerstone as it currently exists today in the Capitol building. This is not the original cornerstone, but one that had been laid commemorating the original laying of the first cornerstone. It had to be removed when they expanded. In a letter from the artist to the architect of the Capitol in 1862, the scenes and figures are explained. He explains that seated on either side of George Washington are two females. One is Lady Liberty, representing authority, and the other is Victory, or the Roman goddess Victoria, which represents victory. Many early Americans saw Washington as the leading founding father of the nation coming to freedom. Thus, as we continue to see the inner circle of the fresco, we see 13 female figures, representing, with stars above their heads, the 13 colonies. The ladies to the immediate left of Lady Liberty are also wearing wreaths of cotton, which represent the southern colonies, which is interesting because this fresco was originally painted at the end of the Civil War. Finally, some of the colonies are holding a banner, which reads E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many, one. That is according to the Apotheosis of Washington, architect of the Capitol. The artist continues to explain in his letter to the architect of the Capitol the layout of the whole painting. Starting below Washington, working clockwise, we see the additional representation figures in the scenes. Number one, the representation of war, with Lady Freedom depicted in a similar manner as the Roman goddess of war Bellona, defeating a tyrannical monarchy. This is an obvious reference to the American Revolutionary War and the Americans' independence from the British Crown. Number 2, we have the representation of science with Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, trade, and craft. Here, Minerva appears to be instructing founding father Benjamin Franklin alongside of Robert Fulton, the American inventor of the first practical submarine and the first successful steamboat, and Samuel F.B. Morse, the American inventor of the electric telegraph and Morse code, all of which took place in the 1800s. Next, we have the representation of marine, or the American nautical achievements, if you will, with the Roman gods Neptune, god of the sea, and Venus, the god of prosperity. Neptune is holding his trident, while Venus is holding a transatlantic cable. You can see it right here a little bit. So that's interesting because the transatlantic cable was being laid at the time of the painting. Next, we have representation of American commerce, with the Roman god of economy, Mercury, standing next to Robert Morse, who was a founding father and merchant who financed the American Revolution and later became the superintendent of finance to the United States. Next, we have the representation of American mechanics, with the Roman god of arms and metalworking, Vulcan, manufacturing a cannon and a steam engine. Lastly, we have the representation of agriculture, with the Roman goddess of agriculture sitting on a mechanized reaper alongside Lady America, who happens to be wearing a red cap, which represents liberation from slavery generally, and the Roman goddess of flowers and spring, the season, Flora. The fresco was painted by Constantino Brumidi at the end of the Civil War. Brumidi is an Italian painter who moved to the United States in 1852. Brumidi studied at the Academy of St. Luke in Rome and became a master at creating, quote, three-dimensional forms on flat surfaces, end quote. He would be asked by the supervising engineer of the Capitol, Captain Montgomery C. Meigs, to begin painting several murals throughout the Capitol building. Constantino Brumidi would eventually refer to himself as, quote, the artist of the Capitol, end quote, because many of his paintings can be seen throughout the Capitol building, especially within the Brumidi corridors. Brumidi would even be later nicknamed the Michelangelo of the Capitol. This information came from Barbara Wolanine, the former curator of the architect of the Capitol. In 1854, the architect of the Capitol, Thomas U. Walter, began designing a cast-iron dome, which would have an outer dome and an inner dome. On August 18, 1862, Walter wrote a letter to Brumidi asking him to submit a design for a canopy fresco to rest between the outer and inner dome of the U.S. Capitol building. Brumidi submitted his design on September 8, 1862, and it was approved on December 24th. Brumidi was to be paid $40,000 for his work, with $2,000 a month being paid to him as a monthly income, according to the scholar Kent Arvins, Constantino Brumidi's Apotheosis of Washington and the Rotunda of the United States Capitol, from the Records of the Columbia Historical Society Journal. The Apotheosis of Washington underwent restoration efforts in 1987 and 1988 because of grime that had developed on the fresco. Today, the fresco canopy is partially obscured by a protective canopy due to ongoing efforts to repair cracks to the U.S. Capitol building's dome on the outside and on the inside. Even the inside of the rotunda is cluttered with scaffolding while repairs are underway. I witnessed these two repairs, the outside and inside, this scaffolding and this donut canopy, they call it, when I personally visited the Capitol building on Wednesday, May 11, 2016. However, as you can tell from this image, the rotunda was flooded with field trip students, visitors, tourists, tour guides, congressional aides, leading others on tours throughout the rotunda. The Apotheosis really is a sight to see, and it portrays the progress of America under the leadership of George Washington, and the fresco is a testimony of the determination and fortitude of Americans to accomplish great things in the name of freedom.